Hey everyone, welcome to Singularity Computers Client Build 19 Part 2. At the end of the last video, we completed the front panel for the build. Now I wanted to start this part of the build log by briefly going back and talking a bit more about the theme for this build, because there's been a number of questions and comments about it. What you're looking at here is a 3D model that was done long before this build was ever started, and this is something that I offer particularly for builds with complex themes and mods, or whenever it's requested, either a 3D model or a detailed sketch. And you can see that what we've ended up with is very close to this original concept, although there are a couple of details missing. Most importantly, the US Navy anchor. Now, the only way we were going to be able to add this was to paint it on. And I really didn't want to do this. The quality would have been just, far too low. It would not have looked right. And that's because we'd already taken the mods too far as it was. And, not every build has an unlimited budget. So what I wanted to do was CNC mill it. And, for it to be a three-dimensional badge, still small and low profile, that would be attached to both of the side panels, and I wanted to do it out of copper or brass so that I could 24 karat gold plate it. But there's a lot involved in that, and yeah, it just was not possible for this build. And I didn't want to cheat and go and buy one and just stick it on, so I didn't end up going ahead with that part of it. The other minor detail was the power sword etched onto the side panel windows. I decided that the build was detailed, cramped enough, and I didn't want to draw away from the hardware inside of the build. The side panel windows are small enough the way it is, so I decided not to do those either. A lot of people have commented on the fact that the art piece on the front panel is not actually Master Chief. Now, the theme for this build is a Halo/Navy theme. It's only ended up being called Master Chief because that also refers to the rank of the client, who is a Navy veteran. So the reason that this particular art piece was chosen as a reference was because it is perfect for what we had in mind. And looking at the back of the art piece here, you can see that it's been airbrushed onto acrylic, a transparent piece of acrylic, with multiple layers. There's multiple layers on the front and back. And we did this because we plan on putting a light source in behind it. And so that when you turn on the light behind it, the art piece changes. And with I think on the original art piece, it's fire down one side. We kind of turned it into lava. It was perfect to make this possible. The custom wiring for the core components is now complete. And for this build, I decided to go ahead with transparent insulation 16 gauge wiring, no sleeving. I will be sleeving the rest of the wiring though. I often have a division between my wiring for core components and the wiring for the rest of the build, because the wiring for the core components is something that is going to be in full view, something that you can really make a feature out of and show off, whereas often the rest of the wiring, or at least most of it, needs to be hidden. So I'm actually going to sleeve the rest of the wiring in a silver or grey so that it blends in with the custom paint job. But we'll come back to the wiring later in the build log. Another component I'm modifying for this build is the memory. So I have here a kit of Corsair Dominator Platinum DDR3. It runs at 1866 MHz C10 1.5 volts. And I'm going to be removing the stock heatsinks and installing EK Monarch module adapters, which I've modified. Now, originally, the only mod that I was going to do to this memory was to 24 karat gold plate the piece that runs across the top of the stock heatsink. It's actually a silver anodized billet aluminium piece of the heatsink, but that didn't go too well because you can't just plate aluminium. There's a bit of a process involved, other chemicals you have to use, and I do have this ability, but it was the first time we were doing it and it didn't work out so well. The gold plating didn't look that great, so I decided to take the memory mods even further, and what I have here is some gold anodized EK Monarch module adapters. So I've actually done the gold anodizing, and I might take you through the process of anodizing later in the build log, because it's, pretty amazing to see. It's a combination of electricity and acid. Not just anyone can do it. You need to do your research, you need to have the right equipment and setup, and it's quite dangerous. There's a lot of work involved in, perfecting your setup, getting the right voltage and current, the right ratio of acid to distilled water. There's a whole lot of things to consider. And, then there's the colors, the dyes that you need to play around with. And gold in particular is a very difficult one, because I've found that unless the alloy is polished, it just looks terrible. But you can see that these EK Monarch module adapters have been polished, and it almost looks like gold plating. It barely even looks like anodizing. So these are going to go really nicely with the 24 karat gold plating that is on the reservoir mount. And that's why I'm adding a little bit more gold to the build, because gold accents was an important part of the original ideas and concept for this build, part of the color scheme. And I didn't just want to have one gold accent on one of the components. Obviously it had to be somewhere else to make sense. Now, the general consensus for removing the stock heatsinks from Corsair Dominator Platinum is that it's risky and not to do it. And after doing it myself, I do kind of agree with this, mainly because of the TIM that Corsair has used, the thermal interface material. It's all very, very strong, adhesive, and very difficult to deal with, which is why I had to use a screwdriver, which I know looks dangerous, but I'm only using it to, slowly lever the different sections apart, because something that you don't want to do with adhesive TIM is, give it one hard pull. You need to just apply a certain amount of pressure, not too much, but then slowly wait for it to detach, bit by bit. Once you apply enough pressure, it will slowly remove, but you need to be patient. And heat is also often necessary, and you can see that I heated the memory modules, but you only heat them up to the point where they start to get a little bit hot to touch, and not up to the point where they actually burn you, because then you can damage the memory. Now, something that I very quickly discovered is that the EK Monarch module adapters don't even fit this memory. I knew this memory was non-standard. The modules themselves are taller, but I didn't realize that the EK Monarch module adapters would not be long enough to even cover the ICs. There's about a quarter still exposed. And, this may not be a problem, but for me it's unacceptable. This is going to be a big feature. So I've decided to scrap the idea of the EK Monarch module adapters and instead modify the stock heatsinks. So we'll come back to this later in the build. Now, the original storage for this build was going to be two Samsung 840 series 250GB SSDs, but I've decided to change this to a single Crucial M550 512GB M.2 SSD, because it's just really going to clean things up. The SSDs were going to be installed down the side of the front radiator, where the extra mount is on the side of the reservoir mount, and they would have just blocked too much view there to the components. There would have been a lot of extra wiring mess. That's really one of the best things about an M.2 SSD, is that it massively decreases wiring mess. So you can see that I've installed the front panel. I've also installed the top panel grille, which we'll take more of a look at later in the build. I've also started installing fittings. I've installed the section of the loop from the pump down to the front radiator, and also the drainage system. I'll also take a closer look at the fittings later in the build log. So looking at the side panels, there's still a little bit that needs to be done. I need to install the side panel windows, and something else that I've done at this point, you can see I've installed these corner sections, and as well as this being for the aesthetics and part of the theme, another little detail, it does have a practical purpose, because we've actually used nutserts, which are thread inserts on the case, instead of just tapping a thread into the thin steel, which there's really not enough thickness in that steel to get a proper thread. The nutserts are excellent, high quality. They can be replaced, but they're very strong. They're going to work extremely well. So we needed the extra corners on the side panels to strengthen things. And these sections here, we've actually milled these. We milled them in a circle and then cut them into quarters. And there's still something that I am going to do to these. You can see they're little triangles, and all the points once they're installed just look really unusual. So I'm actually going to curve the points off to match the other side, so that, you know, they look a little bit more streamlined and not so out of place. And I'm just going to put more curves on all of the edges and then repolish them, because these are polished billet alloy, just like so many of the other components in this build. And these are obviously to hold the side panel windows in position on the outsides of the side panels, but we'll take more of a look at this later in the build log. One of the methods that we planned on using for lighting up the art piece on the front panel was to install 3 or 5mm LEDs around the edges of the acrylic, shining inwards. So you can see the groove that we milled specifically for this, with quite a number of LED positions. But I've decided against this because this is only going to shine the light through the acrylic and out the other side. It's not going to get the glow exactly where I want it. For example, I want to glow specifically in behind the helmet, and LEDs aren't going to give off enough light. I mean, there are some LEDs that might be bright enough, but it also means a massive, messy wiring loom outside of the case itself. It's really not something I'd prefer to do. A much more sensible thing to do would be to use LED fans, because, you know, other than shining the light in from around the outside like that, it would mean putting a light source in behind it right where the fans are, and I can't do that. It's going to be in the way of the fans. So I'm swapping from the Noise Blocker Black Solent Pro PL2s to Cougar CFD 120s. And I'm going to use white LED fans in behind the art piece, which is going to place the light exactly where I need it, and it's going to give a nice soft glow, because I only wanted the light to be subtle. Now, aside from the difference in colors and the addition of the LEDs on the white LED version, these fans are actually the same. They have the same specifications at 1200 RPM, 64.37 CFM, 1.74mm H2O, and 16.6 decibels. They come included with the usual mounting screws, anti-vibration rubber mounts, and a Molex to 3-pin converter. They're a great looking fan. They have a lot of detail and shape in the design. They have built-in anti-vibration rubber mounts, and I always like the look of transparent blades, mainly with all of the shape and detail that these blades have. So these are smoked acrylic, and you can see the fan motor in through the front and the center. It looks amazing. Now they're sleeved with this very fine weave rubbery material similar to Noctua, basically the same. Always, you know, too much heat shrink, a lot to be desired with sleeving on basically every component. But what would there be left to do for us modders if there wasn't sleeving like this? And that's actually exactly what I'm about to change here, because I need to customize the lengths of the fan wiring before I can install the fans. So I'm going to take you through how I get the exact lengths that I need, because this is something I get a lot of questions about. You know, mainly for people who are considering custom wiring. You know, they want custom wiring lengths, but they may not want to do it themselves. They might want to get somebody else to do it. So then they need to get the measurements for themselves so they can send the measurements off to whoever they're going to get to do it. And so I'm going to show you now how you can get these measurements. Now you have 3 good options for setting up fans. Number 1, because this is the one that I end up doing the most, is a splitter PCB. And this one is from Mod My Toys. They have the biggest range. And, you know, range is really something that you need for a splitter PCB, because you can run them off Molex or something else, have different amounts of fans, PWM, you know, split PWM from your motherboard. There's a whole lot of different options, so I suggest you check them out at Performance PCs. I'll put a link in the video description. You also have the ability to run them straight off your motherboard, but that requires a lot more wiring. You need to run all of your fans separately back to your motherboard. You can split some of them, but it's a lot more wiring. But you know, this does come with the benefit of being able to control your fans through the BIOS or software in your operating system. Then you have a dedicated fan controller, and you know, some of these are manual, or a really nice one like the Aquero, not just a fan controller, does a whole lot of different things. Comes with the ability to set up fan curves, which is really the ultimate option and the most high-end option. But as I said, the one I install the most is a splitter PCB, And coming back to getting those wiring lengths, what I'm doing right here, and this is how I get all my wiring lengths for every single cable in all of my builds. I'm using a length of 18 gauge wire, and I'm just laying it in exactly where I want to route my cables. And then I measure this off, cut the wire to length, and build the wire. And in this case, it is getting the wiring lengths, or the cable lengths I need for the fans. So basically cutting them down from their stock length to what I need them to be. And you can see there's quite a process involved, because once you cut the wire, you need to figure out the pin out, put new pins on, sleeve it, put the connector on, and do the heat shrink. There is a lot of work involved, but it's definitely worth it. You can see how incredibly clean it is. Now, this is a little trick that I've been doing for a long time. If you want to change your fans, or if you need to pull fans out to clean them down the track, something like that, you can just undo all of the bolts on your radiator except for one, which you leave loose, and then just tilt the radiator out, slip the fan out from in between. That you only need to do that where the fan is sandwiched between the radiator and a panel. The top fans I was able to just unbolt and then bolt straight back on underneath the radiator, but it does save a fair bit of time. I could easily have just removed the radiator with the pump and res config and the res mount from this build, but I just wanted to do it this way to show you this little trick. So I'm now working on the cable management for the fans, and what I'm doing here, you can see I've added a bit of extra cable length to allow me to hide the cables. I don't just cut the cable down to the exact distance from the fan to the splitter PCB or wherever I'm going. You need to figure out a routing where the cable is going to be nicely hidden. I've removed the stock power and reset buttons, as well as the hard drive and power LEDs and all of the front input-output. What I'm replacing it with is just a single power button, a 16mm Vandal switch. And this is part of my builds that I don't normally show. There's so many little extras like this, which to the overall build are only a very small feature. But overall, all these little details make up a major difference, but they also take a lot of time. So what I'm doing here is directly soldering the wires onto the back of the Vandal switch, so that you don't have to have all of the extra messy plugs. Now, this is from the manual for this motherboard, showing how the front panel cables need to be connected to the motherboard. And the reason I'm showing this is that if you're going to customize your power button wiring, this is something you need to look up. First of all, you need to look up the pinout for the Vandal switch, which should come in the instructions for the Vandal switch. And this will tell you how and where to connect the wiring to the back of the Vandal switch itself. Then you need to look at the pinout for the motherboard. And something else that I'm adding to this power button, and this is another great little trick that I've picked up over the years, is instead of having all of these extra little connectors, which I've always hated, they're incredibly messy, you use a single USB 2 header connector. And this works perfectly for the smaller front panel connectivity headers on the motherboard. You use a single one, and then for the larger ones you can use two side by side, and it is just so much cleaner. So that is definitely one clean power button soldered on the power button side and a USB 2 header on the other side. Very clean way of doing things. Actually, the power button was something that was a little overlooked for this build. Originally, I wanted to put it on the front panel, in the billet alloy section, but that would mean putting a hole through the inner front panel and the outer front panel. It would have been a bit messy, so I decided to hide it around the back instead. Now you can see I've been doing a lot of work on the wiring and cable management. I've actually almost completed the wiring for the build now. You can see I've wired up all of the fans. I've connected them to the splitter PCB, And then I've run a Molex cable direct from the power supply to the splitter PCB. Very clean way of doing things. I've used ModSmart cable management clips, the adhesive ones, to route this cable. You can also see that I've installed all of the cables for the core components, and I think these really suit this build, as does the MDPCX sleeving color that I've chosen, which is a gray. And you know, a combination of this different wiring. I really like this clear insulation wiring. I also used it in client build 16. So I've done everything at this point, all of the wiring, and there's really not much wiring in this build. There's a couple of things that really have reduced the wiring a lot. One is only having a power button, another is having a SATA M.2 SSD, and the other is the way I've wired up the fans. That's the best thing about using a splitter PCB. It's the cleanest way of wiring your fans most of the time. So normally I actually build the loop and fill it before I install the wiring. This way I'm doing things the other way around because there's not much wiring anyway. So normally I do that because the wiring gets in the way of the loop when I'm installing it, and also in case of leaks, so that I don't need to go pulling all of the wiring out. But the wiring is very clean, it's not going to get in the way, and I'm certainly not going to get a leak. So I'm now preparing to start building the water cooling loop, and I'm going to leave this until the next part of the build log. Now I'm actually doing a giveaway that's going to go over the next 7 days, and I'm going to announce the starting date on the forums, social media, my Facebook page, Facebook group, and Twitter. So keep an eye out for that. It's going to be all about the new Singularity Computers website and the forums. So if you want to be involved, you have to be on the forums. I'm going to be giving away some Singularity Computers relics from the vault. All these years of building systems, I've collected a lot of components, and some of these components I'm going to be giving away actually have a lot of sentimental value to me. I really love them. I've kept them for a long time, and they're really collector's items. So I'm going to be giving away some cool stuff. So make sure you check that out if you're interested. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe, like, and favorite if you want to see more.